Good morning, everybody. This is Dr. Heidelin Hernandez from Universidad de La Laguna and Yeraina Set from Universidad de La Laguna and Universidad Europea de Canarias. This paper that we have decided to title Integration Queerdom, Her Hint Stories across the BA in English Studies through project-based learning and case studies addresses a structural limitation in the curricular organization of many BA programs in English Studies. That is, the persistence of queer perspectives as episodic or compartmentalized rather than epistemologically integrated. Despite the institutionalization of queer studies as a critical field, queer approaches in English studies remain largely confined to discrete literary or cultural modules, while linguistics, language application, and core methodological subjects often remain insulated from such perspectives. Following Britzman's arguments that queer pedagogy is less about inclusion than about disrupting regimes of normalization, this paper treats queerness not as a thematic content, but as a methodological lens capable of reorganizing disciplinary inquiry across the degree. The proposed intervention is grounded in the convergence of project-based learning and case study methodology rather than positioning these as a neutral pedagogical tools. The proposal mobilizes them as epistemic structures that align particularly well with queer critique. Project-based learning, as conceptualized by Thomas and further developed in constructivist pedagogy, foregrounds sustained inquiry, iterative knowledge construction, and learner agency. These features resonate with queer epistemologies that resist closure, linearity, and canonical authority. Case studies, on the contrary, understood following by Flickbert, enable thick contextualization and resist the abstraction of knowledge from lived realities, an issue repeatedly foregrounded in queer critiques of universalizing theory. Together, PBL and case studies enable queer perspectives to operate not as illustrative examples, but as the structuring principles of learning design. In linguistics modules, queer integration is articulated through case-based analysis of how grammatical, pragmatic, and discursive systems naturalize gender and sexuality. Rather than treating language as a neutral code, this approach draws on Butler's theorization of performativity and Foucault's account of sexuality as discursively produced. Linguistic structures, pronouns, agreement systems, address forms, are examined as iterative practices that sediment normativity through repetition. Students work on carefully delimited cases, such as institutional policy documents or media discourse, applying discourse analytic frameworks to examine how linguistic choices stabilize or contest gendered assumptions. This aligns with Cameron and Killick's argument that sexuality is not merely indexed by language, but actively constituted through linguistic practice. Crucially, this disciplinary focus remains intact. Students develop analytic competence in discourse and pragmatics, but within a framework that renders normativity analytically visible. In sociolinguistics, the intervention builds on established links between language, identity, and power, but reframes queer communities as epistemically productive rather than merely descriptive objects of study. Drawing on Eckert's concept of indexicality and Hall's work on identity as interactionally produced, case study focus on how linguistic variation functions within queer speech communities to negotiate belonging, authenticity, and resistance. Rather than treating identity categories as pre-existing variables, students analyze how they are co-constructed in interaction. This approach also incorporates insights from queer sociolinguistics, particularly research on trans and non-binary language practices, which challenge binary assumptions embedded in traditional sociolinguistic models. Here, the case study becomes a site for methodological reflection. Students are encouraged to question how sociolinguistics categories themselves may reproduce normative assumptions. In applied language models, queer integration is implemented through case studies examining institutional and professional discourse. Rather than focusing on inclusive language as a checklist, students engage in critical discourse analysis of how institutions govern identity through language. Following Fairclough's conception of discourse as a social practice and Cameron's critique of verbal hegemony, students analyze policy documents, style guides, and corporate communications to examine how inclusion is framed, commodified, or instrumentalized. The focus shifts from whether language is inclusive to how inclusion functions discursively within regimes of governance, risk management, and reputation. Project-based outputs require students to redesign institutional texts while explicitly articulating the ideological assumptions underpinning the revisions. This foregrounds reflexivity and resists the depoliticization of inclusive language practices. In literary and cultural studies, the proposal moves beyond additive models of representation by foregrounding queer reading as a sustained interpretative practice. Building on Sedgwick's analysis of the epistemology of the closet, canonical texts that approach are sites where sexuality structures narrative logic, silence, and legibility. Queer reading is thus framed not as the identification of queer characters, but as an analytical practice that interrogates how desire, normativity, and temporality organize textual meaning. Case studies, on the contrary, are designed around sustained engagement with a single text or corpus, allowing students to trace how interpretative frameworks shape what can be known or said. Digital projects function as applied outputs that materialize interpretative labor while aligning with digital humanities methodology. Finally, in post-colonial modules, queer integration is essential to avoid reproducing universalized Western models of sexuality. Case studies foreground in the section of sexuality with colonial histories, nationalism, and diaspora. Renan Poir's theorization of homonationalism and Gobinath's work on queer diasporas. Students analyze cultural and literary texts to examine how sexual identities are differentially valorized within global power structures. Case study format allowed students to compare contexts and to interrogate the mobility and limits of queer categories across geopolitical locations. This approach explicitly addresses the tension between queer critique and post-colonial theory.